Hi, I'm Frank Dunn. Welcome today to a discussion on why we are so enchanted with labels. June is Pride Month, and Pride brings out all kinds of labels that we in the larger LGBT community use with alacrity and sometimes without thought. I want to tell you my own story about the use of labels. If I had had a label when I was, let's say, 5 years old, perhaps even three, I could have told you that I was a gay boy. I identified very much with everything that girls did and with the women around me. I liked the kinds of things that girls liked, my cousins, my neighbors, and others. I wanted to do things like play house and play with dolls and get dressed up in mama's drag. I have pictures to prove it. Even those pictures include one of my older brother, whom I displaced as only child when he was 10, looking very disgusted at me standing a few yards away behind him, dressed in a skirt, gloves, a pocketbook, and a little hat. I must have been all of 3. The label that I got from him and from others that I could not stand was sissy. I never heard anyone call me that or anyone use the word that didn't use it pejoratively. And I got called that aplenty. I got called that when I began school. And I only tried the harder to deny that I was a sissy and try to find out in due time what it meant not to be one, what it meant not to act like a sissy. I remember riding the school bus, and some of the old country boys that were on that school bus referred to me as sis, which a part of me actually liked because I realized that it was a term of affection as well as a kind of a slur. But that was my first encounter with labels, but hardly my last. By the time I was 13, I learned the label that I went to in every index for every psychology book or every manual on sex that I could ever find, looking to see what was meant by homosexual. And I learned very quickly that that's something one did not want to be. Well, I won't tell you my entire story, but I will tell you that fast forward past 26 years of marriage and 2 children, I came out finally after some years of therapy and some many, many decades of spiritual direction and other kinds of introspection to the point that I could own that I was bisexual. I was happily married, and there was no particular problem with sex in the marriage. My wife knew from the get-go that I was a man who was attracted to other men as well as to her, and she was the only woman that I ever really was romantically involved with or terribly deeply attracted to. So we'd talk about that every once in a while, and yet the label bisexual after a while just didn't fit me. I tried to write an article one time on what it meant to be a bisexual person of faith, and I got the editor's return saying, "This is a wonderful article, and you're a very good writer, but you don't say anything about being bisexual. You say a whole lot about being same-sex attracted." I thought about that and finally came to the conclusion, after not just a little thought, that in fact I was just sidestepping the issue that I was, in fact, a gay boy and a gay man. Well, that came with a great price, the biggest piece of which was marriage. And ultimately, I decided that, well, if I was a gay person, I would simply live like one. And I did. It took me several years to find how to do that. And I'm not sure I ever did find how to do it. But nonetheless, one day, some several years afterwards, after I'd left the city that I had been living in and had moved to Washington, D.C., I was watching a video, a porn video, to be honest. And that video had someone in there with female genitalia, actually a hermaphrodite, not a transgender person or transsexual. Um, and I found it incredibly hot. And I kept telling myself, but you're not supposed to find this incredibly hot. You're gay, and that's not gay. It took me a little while, but not too long, to realize that I was just pigeonholing myself into another category the way I'd pigeonholed myself so effectively for many years into the category called straight. Well, that probably is not just like your story. Could be, but it certainly is not too different from the way we find labels that seem to fit us and we pigeonhole ourselves into the boxes those labels provide and designate. And human beings do that the globe over, I suppose, although I do think that any serious student of history would have to say that Western society in the last several decades, and stretching at a point, the last 150 years, has been increasingly enchanted with labels of all sorts. I think that there were very few labels in medieval times, for example. I don't know that people went around speaking of themselves as peasants or serfs, but certainly that was a category that was affixed to a number of people, and so on. Certainly, to be noble was a category, but we have scads of labels now that designate whether we are this, that, or the other group economically or demographically or religiously or sexually or whatever. And what all of that ignores in exchange for the convenience of using labels is how fluid we are. I've told you just a snippet of the story about how fluid I've been in my life. And while there is some consistency to who I've always been from small child on, there is a good deal of variety within that consistency. I am sometimes attracted to people and to sexual expressions that I never imagined I would be, and that has not changed. The only thing that has changed is the particularity of what I happen to be attracted to at any one particular time. Why not own our fluidity? Why do we have to affix ourselves, um, or affix labels to ourselves as a matter of self-definition? Now, as I say, there is some convenience in that, and there's no doubt some truth behind the label. But it certainly denies a good deal of elasticity that belongs to each of us as a right, as a human quality, as a fulfillment of who we are. I think that there is indeed a deeply important psychological and, to my mind, spiritual issue in this. It's not about behavior, and it isn't about the rightness and wrongness of any particular category, but it is about the fact that we somehow continue to resist ways of being whole. We don't want to claim parts of ourselves that don't fit some grid or other made up by ourselves or by others, adopted by us or imposed upon us. We find a terrible resistance inside us to imagine that we can own all the parts of ourselves, the socially acceptable parts and the not so socially acceptable parts. I don't want to sidetrack into this very much, but I do want to say that if anyone has done any kind of shadow work, either personally or in a group such as the Mankind Project or whatever, you know what I'm talking about. You know how difficult it is to own the shadow. And while that is itself a convenient expression, a label, if you will, on a part of our reality, it's certainly a descriptive one. And what I've learned is that in order to be a whole person, I need to own every part of myself. I have to own my ego, not despise it, and realize that it's given the job of being the conductor of the symphony. But it's not the only piece of the symphony, the only actor in the symphony. Simply the conductor who's holding the baton, or if you will, in another metaphor, the gear shift to shift down or to shift up into some other focus, or to back to the orchestral simile, it is like the conductor calling forth the trumpets and listening to the clarity of the trumpets, or the mellowness of the cello, or the sweetness of the violin, or the um, the playfulness of the piccolo or the flute or whatever. Uh, all of those things are like the different parts of me or you that we have a right and a privilege to cassette, to bring out, to invite into awareness. Not because we want necessarily to put them all on parade or make them all public, but because deep down, we're all of those things. Tennyson said one time, I'm a part of all that I've met. And I could say as well, I'm a part of all the different pieces, characters within me. D.H. Lawrence likened it to be a forest out of which strange beings come into the clearing and then receive. Strange gods come out of the forest and then go back into it. Another way of looking at it is the sea, out of which come many, many forms of light, all disappear back into the sea. Whatever your metaphor, whatever your way of understanding it, all of these parts of you don't need necessarily to be labeled any more than we have to give everything a label, which is where nouns come in handy. But they are parts of ourselves that we need to own. So I would suggest that in this Pride Month, that rather than be proud of whatever label you happen to affix to yourself, that you be proud of the fact that there are so many, many, many shades of the rainbow. And they're not all just the rainbow made up of different people, different types, but they're the rainbow in you. Let it be a month of celebration, and let the month never end. Thank you for joining me. I hope you will next month as well.